What's going on, everybody? Today is a great day to break down the top 12 wide receivers in fantasy football land ahead of the 2025 season. So let's get right after it. Starting off with Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and CD Lamb. Dwayne, these are our rankers' top three consensus players. I fully agree with it. You seem to as well. That's why it's that way in your rankings. But my big question is, because we all know Chase Jefferson, CD, certified ballers, why are we actually drafting any running backs ahead of these guys?
Yeah, I think it really only comes down to your league settings, Ian. If you're playing in a PPR league, especially one that starts three wide receivers, I think you should be taking one of these wide receivers for sure with your first three picks. If you're playing in a league that's PPR, but you only start two guys, then I think you can start to make the case for someone like, Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson. I will say this, like if we go back historically, back to 2011, and we look at the top 12 producers each year in PPR scoring formats, it is a slight edge to the wide receivers, and they actually win every bucket all the way down. We can look at wide receiver twos, wide receiver threes, and so on. But if you isolate it down to just the top three finishers each year, the running backs still perform really well. The problem is we don't always know which ones it's going to be. The good news this year is we do have a good beat on some of these younger players like a Bijan Robinson, already mentioned, a Saquon Barkley. So they can offer you some ceiling that historically, we don't always see from the wide receivers. So I think you could still make a case for taking one of the running backs, even in a three wide receiver in PPR. But I would lean to the wide receivers myself. It'd have to get to that two wide receiver setting before I would really do it. I think once you get to standard leagues, you're taking a running back, and half PPR, two wide receivers, I would be much more willing to take a running back. But if it's half PPR and you got to take three wide receivers like underdog, well, then that changes things. So I'm with you, and they're just all these wide receivers are in their prime, right? We're talking about guys that are 25 to 26 years old that have been good every single year. And the other thing that we've talked about is that the wide receiver year-over-year points per game in fantasy football is more predictive than running back. We get bigger swings at that running back position. So I am leaning to the wide receivers with you. There are certain formats where I would go running back.
And it was an interesting 1 year sample size we just had where, guess what? A lot of the wide receivers got hurt. And a lot of the running backs were able to stay more healthy than what we've seen in recent years. But I will say, even again with that storyline going on, we had guys like Devon Achane, Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, players that still wound up playing through the pain, but were at, quite a bit less than 100%. I still do think over a larger sample size, we do see a bit better health run out for these wide receivers. So accordingly, Dwayne, in full PPR, I do think it makes sense to prioritize these guys. I was, somewhat hoping you wouldn't be sharing that sentiment because your very own projections on fantasylife.com have four wide receivers at the top, when you are looking at just full PPR scoring, but we are indeed on the same page. So for those running backs though, Dwayne, just Saquon Barkley and Bijan Robinson for you in half PPR settings.
Yeah, for sure. Now, look, we know that Jahmyr Gibbs has got that contingency upside to be the running back one overall, but we know right now he's still sharing with David Montgomery. I think the one other guy you could look at would be Genty, but at that point, you're pushing it. I'm just going to take one of these guys that we know is an amazing young wide receiver in their prime and just not try to muck it up too much. So, yeah, I'm with you. I like the 3 to 4 wide receivers at the top with PPR.
Obviously, we do have a bit of a tier break after these big three. That takes us to our consensus wide receiver 4, though. Puka Nacua, who when we were really doing our way too early ranks back in January, February, Dwayne, we had in this top tier with these guys. However, the newfound presence of Devontae Adams has led to just a little strop in, I guess, how we feel about the guys. So, look, I understand he has had to play with Cooper Kupp over these past 2 seasons, so it's not like he's completely, has never seen target competition before. But I would say that even in the year 2025, Adams has a chance to be a bigger thorn in the side of Puka than what we saw from Kupp for these past 2 seasons. So how worried are you, Dwayne, about the newfound presence of Adams in this offense?
I'm honestly not that worried. And it goes back to what you started with. We've actually seen this Rams offense channel everything through 2 players for the last 2 years. And when you've had Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua healthy, it's been those 2 guys. The other thing I think that I look at, Ian, is I get it. Cooper Kupp is on the downtrend now. But when Puka Nacua first got there, it's not that we necessarily thought that. Yes, Cooper Kupp had to battle some injuries. That opened things up for Puka Nacua in his rookie season. But at the same time, we still really liked Cooper Kupp. And Nakua just came in and literally like took the mantle from him, like in his rookie season, to become the wide receiver one for the Rams. So when I look at that and I think how young the guy is, I'm just not going to worry about it too much. You know, Sean McVay is also there. We know he's going to design the looks for Nakua. Nakua is basically like, he's like a tank, dude. You get him the ball behind the line of scrimmage, he looks more like Tank Bigsby, right, than a wide receiver out there. So I just think that he can do so many different things for the offense. Also a great boundary player. You know, he and Stafford, they've got a great connection there. I do agree that Adams is better than Cooper Kupp at this point. So like we can't completely dismiss it. And I think that's why we have slid him down just a little bit in the ranks. But the way I look at him is he's kind of in his own tier. We're going to talk about Nico Collins in a second. I think there is a way you could argue that it should be Puka and Nico in that second tier together. But I think with Puka, what he's done the first 2 years also has stayed a little bit healthier than what we've seen from Nico. I think you could make a good case that he's kind of in his own tier after those top three wide receivers.
Because I mean, again, just what we've seen these first 2 years, I use my eyes to evaluate talent too, guys. I'm not just addicted to the spreadsheet. So I do think Chase, Jefferson, CD's a little bit closer, but I would give them just the edge over Puka just based on having watched football over the past 2 years. But man, Dwain, 489 players with at least 100 targets since 2015. Puka is first in both yards per route run and targets per route run. So pretty large sample there. And he, again, is coming out on top, the wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game over these past 2 years. And yes, Adams is, a bit of a threat to get there. But you mentioned it, man, they've already condensed the offense around 2 guys enough. And I don't want to be the boy who cried vacated targets, all right? Because I understand that's not always the best thing to go through when we're looking at a changing, offensive personnel situation. But we're talking about over 160 targets that are available because Cooper Kupp, because DeMarcus Robinson are gone. I mean, that would be the issue that I would have, Dwain. We actually had a rumor come out this morning about how the Rams wanted to trade up for Ted McMillan, get him at number 8. If we had a situation like that where you're adding someone to an environment where you're really not losing anything, then maybe I could wrap my mind more around, again, targets being an issue.
Yeah, I would be more concerned if we had a third option in the offense that was really like a potential threat. Like we're gonna have to talk about that here in a little bit, like with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and what they're dealing with the arrival of Emeka Egbuka. Like you don't have that going on here at the Rams. So I still think when you look at Tutu Atwell, obviously like he's a nice complementary piece, but we don't worry about him like really stealing targets away from Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams. Yes, guys, they did draft a tight end higher than anyone thought they would with Terrence Ferguson, but I'm just not gonna freak out about a profile like Terrence Ferguson. Maybe he will do a little bit of something in the Rams offense. But right now, when we look at this offense, it's very clearly to me an offense is going to channel through Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams. So I'm with you. Not worried too much. Had they added Ted McMillan, that would have definitely changed the narrative.
Sidebar, though, Dwayne, because I want to make everything about DeAndre Swift in the year 2025. I'm old enough to remember 2 weeks ago when this report comes out that the Bears were looking to trade up for Travion Henderson. Didn't happen. And then I had to watch as the entirety of, fantasy football Twitter said, oh, look, see, the Bears didn't even want DeAndre Swift to be this guy. They wanted to trade up for a running back. Certainly didn't have, 5 more rounds to draft one they liked or whatever. They waited till round 7. But come on, can we admit that's freaking ridiculous? Because no one with a brain looks at this and says, oh my God, the Rams wanted to trade up for Ted McMillan. This is such bad news for Puka and Adams. When will the DeAndre Swift slander end, Dwayne?
Well, I think it's just because Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams have actually proven to be elite players multiple years, right? And we just haven't gotten it yet from DeAndre Swift. We like some of the underlying things. Actually, we've had years where we're like, man, the underlying things really look like a running back 1, but he's never given us that true running back 1 production. So I think it just comes back to that, Ian. People have fatigue around DeAndre Swift, and a lot of fantasy analysts in particular have been in on DeAndre Swift multiple years, and he's burned them multiple times. He's kind of like the Kyle Pitts of running backs. That's the way I'm looking at DeAndre
go there.
Swift
He's been top 24 every year.
I'm talking about the way people feel about him, Ian. Not forget facts, dude. Just think about the way people feel about him. Okay, it does. I mean, it is an emotional game. Like as much as we try to make this about the spreadsheets and we try to make this about and also what we see with our eyes, and we try to be very objective. Feelings can make us subjective at times, and I think that's what happens with DeAndre Swift.
Okay, I will now promise to leave DeAndre Swift out of the rest of our wide receiver breakdown ahead of 2025. But again, wanted to get that off my chest. So I want to focus on a pair of rising second-year wide receivers, Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr., who were awesome in year one. Okay, now we're looking at guys who are being priced as top 6 options at the position. And look, we're in line here, right? We love these players. You have them ranked wide receiver 5, wide receiver 7 in favor of Brian Thomas Jr. I have Malik Nabers wide receiver 6 and BTJ wide receiver 7. So I want to start that off before we try to play a little bit devil's advocate to maybe not chasing these guys up in round 1, because again, man, awesome rookie years, but we're looking at guys where at the end of the day, Malik Nabers, wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game, Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver 11. Could you argue that maybe we should be a bit more worried about that quarterback situation in New York? Maybe we should be a bit more worried about Travis Hunter coming into the equation now in that Jaguars offense, or should we just not worry about it at all because look how good they are?
Well, I think if they had a quarterback and if they were in better offenses, they would be going even higher. I think those are the factors that are keeping them at the end of round 1, sometimes slipping that round 1 term, but mostly going in round 1 of fantasy drafts right now. And I look at it this way, right? The last time we've had someone put up similar PPR numbers and plus had all the underlying data points match up as well, which would be target share, yards per route run, even through in PFF receiving grade. This is the comp list. Ian, Odell Beckham Jr., who went on to continue to be an elite wide receiver 1 for the next 2 seasons. Justin Jefferson, we just talked about him. He's one of the top guys. You know, you could argue he should be the first pick in fantasy drafts this year. Right now, it's mostly Jamar Chase going there. Puka Nacua, another guy we just talked about. And then we have Jamar Chase himself. So, I mean, this is the elite list of all elites. So really, I think if we had quarterbacks that were good for Malik Nabers, and Brian Thomas might be okay with Trevor Lawrence. You know, we've talked about him. Folks can go back and check out the QB show. We're actually a little higher on Trevor Lawrence this year than we have been, you know, maybe in recent years. I should say myself. Ian's been a Trevor Lawrence supporter. I would probably be more in the hater category. But they've just been so good, man. It's hard to, what else are we going to do? Like who would we switch them out for would be the question. Like, who are we going to take ahead of them? I do think that underdog drafters are starting to adapt a little bit. And we've now seen Christian McCaffrey climb out of that early round 2 position to now he's going pick 9 or 10 at the end of round 1. That's the one guy that I think you could make an argument for that is kind of like, man, even if CMC's like 80% of his old self, like he would still have a really good chance to outscore these guys if the 49ers offense is what we typically think of with a Kyle Shanahan 49ers offense.
I think you could make an argument that our one true sun god and also Nico Collins could be going ahead of these guys. And again, now we're talking about them being wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8, maybe wide receiver 9. All right. They're still top 10 regardless. So I know we're kind of nitpicking here, but with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Nico Collins, I feel better about CJ Stroud and Jared Goff, despite Stroud's QB 28 finish in fantasy points per game last season. Had to get that in there one more time, but I do feel better about them than what we see from T Law, than what we could have, you know, with 36-year-old Russell Wilson coming here. The target competition doesn't seem like it's that much more in terms of, you know, Neighbor or BTJ's favor. So that would be my thing. Because I know we're going to talk about the Sun God here in a little bit, but we've seen 3 straight top 10 finishes from Amon-Ra. We love the Lions offense. I mean, is really that, you know, because I know you've been doing your upside projections and everything. I'm sure Neighbors and BTJ do have a slightly higher ceiling than Amon-Ra, but isn't there something to be said that, hey, it's round 1. Give me the guy who we're probably more sure about finishing top 10 than anyone?
Well, I think you can make an argument these guys are all really in a tier together. And if you were just picking for floor only, I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown might be like in the top 4 picks, right, of the round. Yeah. I mean, he's shown a tremendous floor. Now, he had a stretch last year where we got a little bit worried that, man, whenever you got J-Mo really going, you got Sam Laporta going, it can be a challenge for targets, especially in those games where they want to run the ball. But a lot of it ends up leveling out because the Lions offense is so good. And then we also just saw Amon-Ra St. Brown go on a true sun god tear to end the season. It was helping win fantasy championships. And it was kind of like, oh yeah, this is just what happens, right? We have these little lulls in fantasy where you might get 3 or 4 weeks where it's like, oh man, like Amon-Ra St. Brown is not as good with these other guys in the offense. And then he just goes off and rips off, you know, league winning scores to finish the season. So that's just the way it works sometimes. So yeah, I think this is one big tier. I agree with you that if you were just picking for floor, like Amon-Ra probably is above all of these guys. But whenever we're drafting these things, you know, I tend to lean towards the ceiling. They're all really close. But I think, again, I think you can make an argument that they're all in one tier together. I don't know that you necessarily have to have a tier break with these players.
And I guess with Neighbors, I'm a little bit less concerned just because we have the same coordinator. We have the same offense going out there with Slayton and Wandale and 3 wide receiver sets. And accordingly, Neighbors is the #1 player in the league in terms of your target projections right now. And again, it's hard for me to really look past that. He did finish as the wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game already. Why couldn't he do it with what probably will be an improved quarterback room? BTJ is just one I get a little more concerned about because I do think there are some reddish flags, kind of burnt orange sort of color, because again, man, he only had 103 target pace in terms of 17 games when Trevor Lawrence was under center. That ballooned up to 204 with Mac Jones. I think Liam Cohen's good and everything. Let's face it, a lot of people didn't really know who he was 24 months ago. Great last season in Tampa Bay. I think you could also say Bucky, Mike, Godwin, maybe those guys deserve a little bit of credit for their success as well. And again, when you add Travis Hunter to the equation, don't you think we could be looking at the targets in week 6 just going, man, this is like 50-50 between BTJ and Hunter right now?
Yeah, it's just hard to ignore the ceiling, man. I know what you're talking about. I don't think it was so much Mac Jones versus Trevor Lawrence. I think it was more to do with Christian Kirk and then also Evan Ingram, them being gone from the offense at the end of the year, which you could still make an argument because you just did. You're like, and you added Travis Hunter. So he kind of offsets the loss of those 2 players, or at least one of those players, probably not 2 of them completely. But sure, it's just hard to ignore Ian at the end of the year. 32.5, 28.2, 23.9, and 17 fantasy points, right? That's weeks 15 through 18. And even if you go back to whenever, he was dealing with, still having some of the other guys in the offense, in week 4, you gave you 22 points, 23 points in week 5, 20 points in week 7. He's just shown a ceiling that historically, like, we really want to be a part of. And he is in that group with Malik Nabers that comps to those other wide receivers that I just talked about. So I think that they're, the reasons you bring up, like, they're legit. But at the same time, I feel like this is going to be pretty similar to what we just talked about with the Rams. There's not a third option on the Jaguars that I really worry about. If there was, that would slightly change things, but it's not like they have a slot wide receiver that's going to come out there and steal a lot of targets. Like, if Christian Kirk was actually still here, I think there would be a little bit more to be concerned about with Brian Thomas Jr. But just with him and Travis Hunter, I think they can funnel most of the offense through them. We like Brenton Strange, but you and I aren't like going to project Brenton Strange to come in and suddenly, be like, this top 6 tight end that we'd be worried about stealing targets away from Brian Thomas Jr. So I think it will mostly be an offense that funnels through these 2 players. Obviously, he's not going to score 30 fantasy points per game, but again, he has shown that upside, which is a huge part of what we care about.
And again, going back to the beginning, I do trust my eyes, say at the end of the day, and Brian Thomas Jr. is just so freaking good out there, okay? You can draw parallels. You can. I'm not going to, but you could with Jerry Jeudy's second half breakout and some of the injuries and the quarterback change that caused that. But in BTJ's credit, was still putting up some good numbers even during those first 8 weeks of the season with a healthy Christian Kirk. Just didn't have, as high a target share. Would make a lot of sense in year 2 with, again, a coordinator who we do believe to be pretty good if things get that much better. So all that to say, yes, we are buying BTJ and Neighbors at their current ADPs. All right, Dwain, we mentioned his name briefly, but Nico Collins looks a bit more like the undisputed #1 wide receiver in his offense than almost anyone here. All right, Malik Nabers, I'll give him that crown. But when we have Jamar Chase, we have T. Higgins with Jefferson, we got Jordan Addison, even CD with George Pickens. Now, again, I do think you can make an argument that Nico could be right there with Nabers in terms of the projected targets that he could be seeing this year. So he is my wide receiver 5. You have him just a little bit lower, but where's the disrespect here, Dwain? Come on.
Well, again, like I said, this is all one tier, and I don't blame anybody if they want to take Nico earlier. The only reason I have Nico below those guys is really just due to injury concern. And I'm not saying we can predict injuries, but I mean, over the last 4 years, starting with the most previous one, it's 12, 15, 10, and 14 games played. And he's played through some injuries. He seems to have some soft tissue stuff that crops up from time to time. And that can happen when you're an absolute baller like Nico Collins, who they try to get involved around the line of scrimmage. They try to get him involved in the intermediate game deep. He really does attack all the different layers of the field. I'll say this, Ian, like, would it surprise me if Nico Collins finished up as the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy football? No, it wouldn't. I really do believe that's in his range of outcomes. And if you look at our ceiling projections, Nico actually comes in higher than Brian Thomas Jr. He actually comes in higher than Malik Nabers. He comes in the tier with Puka Nacua. And that's why earlier whenever I was talking about Nacua and the tier that he's in, like, I think you could make an argument that like Nico Collins belongs right there in that tier. The only reason I kept him down is just a little bit of an injury concern. And again, not trying to say I can predict these things, but we've got 4 years in a row where he's missed a little bit of time. So I just gave that slightly just pushed him down below the other guys. Again, not saying that's necessarily going to all work out that way this season, but that was just my thought process. So love him as a player. I mean, this is a guy that like all the underlying data points, Ian, point to an absolute freaking elite wide receiver. I mean, if we look at his target shares and what's happened with those each year, they've continued to go up. So if we look at Nico, 21%, then 25%. But looking at his targets per route run, man, 26% in 2023. That moved up to 28% last year. Yards per route run, 3.10 in 2023, 2.87 in 2024. Guys, if you get to a yards per route run as a wide receiver of 2, that's considered really good. Nico's blowing these numbers out of the water more in like a Julio Jones kind of style. So, Ian, I totally get where you're coming from. Again, I would not be surprised at all if Nico Collins pulled down the wide receiver 1 overall, title this year. I think it's in his range of outcomes. Just got to stay healthy.
And again, I understand that comping anyone to Julio Jones feels just sacrilegious and like something you shouldn't do. But over these past 2 years, man, that's been the high-end comp for the guy. His ability to, again, just take that short crosser or slant through the house, also to threaten defenders deep downfield, and just to go up there and get it as well. Only Brandon Ayuk overall has actually averaged more yards per target over these past 2 seasons. Certainly was on his way to losing that throne if he actually had stayed healthy last year as well. So all the respect in the world to Nico. And again, I just think that anyone out there, even if you're pessimistic on Nico, give him the talent, give him the target ceiling. I think you'd have a really hard time ranking him outside your top 10 wide receivers and maybe even overall players, Dwain. So this is where it kind of takes us because he is my overall 8 player. He is your 10th guy. So why do you still lean towards someone like Ashton Jeanty, who, again, great profile and everything. I'm not debating that. But with Nico, I hear it. It's really tough to find any sort of issue with someone like Jeanty, with someone like McCaffrey. I just feel like there's maybe some brighter red flags that when it comes to a round 1 pick, give me Nico.
Yeah, I think these guys are all terrific players. This is actually, if you look back at the history of round 1s, like this is one where we're pretty loaded, man. We've got a lot of young players that are sitting here in the top 12. I know CMC is starting to creep into that back half of round 1, but before that, like, we don't have a bunch of guys sitting up here that are 29, 30, 31, 32 years old where we could see some slippage going on. These guys are all in their prime. So you can make an absolute argument for a guy like Nico Collins over a rookie in Ashton Jeanty. I just look at Jeanty, I look at that depth chart, Ian, and I just don't see a way he's not getting 325 to 350 touches. Like, it's just like, could it happen? Yeah, but they just spent the early pick on him. Like, I'm just going to go ahead and bet on it. But again, I could not blame anyone if they wanted to take Nico over Ashton Jeanty. And I also think that, again, back to like what we talked about when we started, if you're playing in a 3 wide receiver league that's PPR, I would lean to Nico Collins over Ashton Jeanty. And if you think about it, we already said Nico Collins has in his range of outcomes, he could be the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy football. And we just talked about earlier, we were taking CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, as well as Justin Jefferson over Bijan. So it's kind of the same argument here. So I do think this comes down to what type of league you're playing in. Half PPR, I'm going to lean more back to Jeanty if it's 2 wide receivers. If it's 3, I think it's kind of a coin flip between the 2 players. But again, this is such a great tier, and these are really hard decisions to make. And it's not just isolated to the wide receivers. And we haven't even talked about tight ends, which we're not talking about in round 1, but we've got a guy like Brock Bowers who, you're taking in the middle of the 2nd round. It's just, we have a lot of young talent, right? And we have a lot of players in their prime. So it's just a great time to be playing fantasy football and to get a chance to argue about these sort of things.
I do wonder if Nico could be the guy where right now, because let's face it, I don't want to say all drafters right now are sharp. You might just be crazy, which is fine. We're here for you either way. But I do wonder if, seeing Nico at the end of round 1, if he could be one of these guys where once we get into the August, the ESPN and Yahoo drafts, just with, again, the more broad fantasy audience, like Dwain, could you see Nico maybe being the guy who actually falls into round 2? Because I'm just not sure, the worldwide public perception is quite as attuned with him being this freaking good as maybe, again, the more casual footballers who just kind of, open up their laptop in August and say, time to draft someone. Because God forbid we get a round 2 ADP on Nico. I mean, that's going to be an auto click every draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, last year, like we couldn't believe that we were getting Nico in round 3, and now this year, I wouldn't. It would be the same way if I could get him in round 2. Like it would be
Right.
if Nico Collins was going in round 2, I would literally just probably pick him every draft. There would not be a draft where I didn't take him. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. Like I don't know for sure. It's always hard to predict like how people are going to handle these things. But I could see someone like Nico Collins slipping into round 2, and maybe people get a little bit more worried about the injuries. Like I've already taken that out, and that's why he's towards the end of round 1 behind a couple of the other guys that we've talked about. But there are things like that like enter people's mind, right, where they just don't want to deal with potentially an injury factor, something like that. So yeah, I could see it happening, but whether he goes at the end of round 1, early round 2, man, Nico's a player you should be happy to have on your fantasy team.
Again, guys, we're breaking down the top 12 wide receivers over at fantasylife.com right now. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb are top 3, followed by Puka Nacua, Brian Thomas Jr., Nico Collins, and Malik Nabers. But after that group, we have someone who, again, has really been as consistent as anyone, and that is our one true sun god, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Just keeps on putting up the wide receiver numbers. Last 3 years, he's finished as the wide receiver 10, and then back-to-back wide receiver 4 finishes. So on the one hand, Dwain, I think even if we've come around, especially in full PPR land, to like, okay, slot receivers, slot primary receivers can still put up these big numbers. They can still be number 1 guys. I still think we have in our head like, oh, he just doesn't have as much upside as, the Justin Jeffersons, Jamar Chases. And yeah, they're better than Amon-Ra. I'm not trying to say that. But guess what, man? We'll take the guy who catches 110 balls versus 80 balls any day of the week in full PPR. So with Amon-Ra St. Brown, like, is he someone where once we do get to the Christian McCaffreys and the Derrick Henrys of the world, where there's enough data with some of the, more injury-prone older running backs, are you just taking the Lions wide receiver 1?
Yeah, I am. And again, like he's got an amazing floor. There is a little bit of a concern. We talked about the hot run he went on at the end of the year, despite having to battle, more players for targets last year. But it did manifest, like it showed up, right? In 2023, we're talking about a guy that had 158 targets in 16 games. That went down to 138 targets last season in 17 games. His targets per route run over the last 3 years have gone from 29 to 27 to 25%. So 25% targets per route run is still a really good number, right? But if you're going to be a lower ADOT player that's going to really live off of, on getting those catches, because we know he's not going to break as many huge plays. He's not going to win over the top like some of the other guys you mentioned earlier. He really does need the receptions, Ian, to come through. So that's the one part that, like, I think pushes him down for me. But I'm still not worried overall about his floor. I think his floor is still really strong. More what pushes him down to this range is I just don't know that he has the same ceiling, because he's a little bit more limited in the amount of targets that he's going to get. And when he does get the targets, he doesn't have quite the same skill set as some of the other players. I think the guy that's really close, and you mentioned it earlier, is CeeDee Lamb. I don't think CeeDee Lamb is in the same tier as Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase if we're just talking pure football and the different things that they can do. We love him in fantasy. He's in the same tier as those guys, a young, really, really good wide receiver, but not quite on the same level as those other two. Amon-Ra, I think, is kind of in that same group. I think Puka Nacua also in that same group. So Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, if we're just talking X's and O's, they're the guys that really can do everything. And so Amon-Ra, and I think Nico Collins actually is another one of those guys that can do all of it. Brian Thomas Jr. can do all of it. You mentioned that. So again, we have these different flavors, and they land on these different offenses, and there's different ways these players can get to their points. So the other beauty for Amon-Ra is he plays in, if you had to pick an offense like to lead the league in points this year, are you choosing anyone other than the Lions? That's a huge thing going for Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Right now, shout out to Adam Levitin, actually put this tweet up, but you can actually use, the Vegas implied totals from every single game to get an idea of where Vegas actually is ranking all these offense. And the Lions right now coming in third, only behind the Ravens and the Bills. But again, they're all, joining the Chiefs and the Washington Commanders and the Eagles. That's the only offense that's implied for over 25 points. And that was kind of one of the issues that, again, I was just looking at with Amon-Ra versus Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr., because Nabers, Giants are implied to score 30th most points this year. The Jaguars, they're up, but they're still 20th. So I guess, again, we love the floor here. No doubt about that. Trying to figure out where things could go wrong for Amon-Ra. Like, do you think there's a chance, Dwayne, we're sitting here in week 4, Jared Goff, maybe looking a bit more like 2021 Jared Goff, and it's like, oh yeah, the offensive coordinator who we haven't stopped lauding for the last 3 years, when he leaves your team, maybe that's not good. Again, I understand they're going to try to keep the continuity, but remember in the Waterboy, Dwain, you had the coach with his green notebook and he was like the offensive mastermind. Like, okay, when he left, they stole the notebook and the plays, and that worked for a while, but at some point, man, you would think that the Lions offense is going to be worse off without Ben Johnson.
Yeah, so I think the place where you could see Amon-Ra regress, and I should have mentioned this earlier because I talked about how his targets went down, but it didn't ultimately result in less fantasy points. His catch rate last year, 83%. The year before, 75. The year before, 76. The year before, 78. So it's always a really good number for him. But he is due for regression. Like, he and Jared Goff were just like complete hand in glove last year, and it's going to be tough to keep that rate up. And that's what ultimately saved his receptions. They only dropped from 119 to 115. It could have been a little bit more of a hit, right, if they hadn't been just so locked in with each other last year and just truly vibing. So I think there's a little bit of a room for negative regression in that catch department. The other thing is he scored 12 touchdowns last year. In the previous seasons, 5, 6, 10. Now, obviously, the Lions' offense over the last 2 years is the version that we think is probably closer to what we're going to see this year. Again, we'll see what happens with Ben Johnson gone, but he scored 10 and 12 touchdowns. But he is a profile where we wouldn't be surprised if he was more like 8 or 9 touchdowns. And I think that's the path. It sounds kind of silly, but you're like, oh man, we're really nitpicking, and we are. To push a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown down, guys, like the Sun God, we love him. You do kind of have to nitpick, but I think the catch regression stuff, and suddenly he catches 8 or 9 touchdowns instead of 10 or 12. That's ultimately what's going to be when you look back. You're like, oh man, maybe he should have been a high round 2 pick, not a late round 1 pick. So I think if you're really trying to nitpick, those would be the areas that you would look at.
Per Next Gen Stats, they have an awesome new suite of tools you can actually get with their NFL Pro package. But Amon-Ra St. Brown last year, number 1 among wide receivers with at least 70 targets, and catch rate over expected north of 11%. So guess what though? You look at the other guys up there: AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, Terry McLaurin. You're also seeing some of the great wide receivers. And Dwain, what I really like about this stat that again I didn't really know about until this past offseason, at the bottom, Dontavian Wicks, Deontay Johnson, Xavier Worthy, Amari Cooper. It's really perfect again, where I see, a lot of times with these stats, you can point out, the 1 out of 6 guys, and there's an issue going on, and no stat is perfect, but directionally correct, as we like to say. Certainly seems like catch rate over expected might be onto something. So moving on from Amon-Ra St. Brown, though, this is where things start to get, I would say, a little bit more tricky. Okay, so far we've been trying to find issues with these players, but guess what? They're going round 1 for a reason. It's been hard for anyone to find an issue with them. If they had, then they wouldn't be going again so consistently inside the top 12 picks. But moving on to AJ Brown, who his per route numbers last year were fantastic. Okay, targets and yards, everything was great. However, we are in an Eagles offense that, as we know, doesn't exactly love to throw the football, because why would they when they have Saquon Barkley and everything Jalen Hurts brings to the table as well? So I will say, you look at it, man, 2022, 2023, AJB still had 145 and 158 targets. He only turns 28 in June. Happy early birthday, AJB. But do you think we're potentially, Dwain, discounting the potential for a boom year here? Because, hey, I saw PFF's Trevor Sikkema make a decent argument that I'm with you. I don't think CeeDee Lamb is quite up there with Jefferson and Chase, but you can make an argument AJ Brown is.
Yeah, I think that AJ Brown is actually a better receiver than CeeDee Lamb.
Right.
All around. If we have to look at all the levels to the game. CeeDee's a great player you can get on the move. You can put him in the slot. You can let him catch those little crossers, do his run after the catch thing. But if you isolate CeeDee Lamb on the outside, you make him win over the top and at all these different levels, he's not the same as AJ Brown. And again, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. I love CeeDee Lamb, but I can also sit here and admit that AJ Brown is probably one of the best 4 or 5 wide receivers in the NFL. And we just named a bunch of young, good players. The only challenge for AJ Brown is we've got this offense that wants to be run heavy. They just won the Super Bowl. They're probably going to run it back again, Ian. Now, injuries, different things can happen. Chaos, often starts whenever the NFL season gets going. The challenge is on a run-heavy offense when you also have Devonta Smith on your roster, who's one of the best wide receiver 2s in the NFL, and then you have probably a top 7 or 8 tight end just from a pure talent standpoint, and Dallas Goedert. Minimum top 10 probably for Dallas Goedert if you're ranking the tight ends just on talent. So you've also got these other options that you want to get the ball to in the passing game. It's like the trifecta of bad things for A.J. Brown, even though he's on a really good offense and he's a really good player. It's that he has to share this smaller pie because they want to run. But the paths to him absolutely obliterating this are the same things. What if Devonta Smith doesn't play for a stretch of game? Knock on wood. We never want players to get injured, but we know that it happens. It's a violent game. What if suddenly, teams are playing better against the run game for the Eagles? What if something happens with Saquon Barkley? What if something happens with the offensive lineman? What if suddenly the defense takes a step back and they have to play in more shootouts? There's a lot of paths for A.J. Brown to end up being, a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. I mean, because if you look at the underlying data points, Ian, he's much closer to the guys you mentioned in Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Nico Collins. Targets per route run, 26% each of the last 2 years. Yards per route run, 2.52, 2.99. Dude, you give this dude man coverage, like no one locks onto their number one more than Jalen Hurts when you get a guy like A.J. Brown out there in man coverage. Man, his targets per route run against man the last 2 years, 37 and 38%, even though they have Devonta Smith lined up and he's probably getting man coverage too, Ian. And then you have Dallas Goedert. So there's just so many things about A.J. Brown. Obviously passes the eye test as well. He can win anywhere on the field, but he can also just take a short, catch and take it to the house, right? And he doesn't just have to outrun angles. This is a dude that can just freaking stiff arm some of the best linebackers and safeties in the league. So A.J. Brown is an absolute beast. And what's interesting about him, all the things that hold him down and make him a round 2 pick are all the same things that if they go a little bit different way, we could be talking about a guy that we wish we would have taken in round 1 of fantasy drafts.
And I think those reasons are why we have him ranked behind guys like Nico and Amon-Ra St. Brown, maybe players who we don't think are quite as good in real life. But this is where it does get interesting with AJ being someone like Ladd McConkey, who was great last year. Every wide receiver we've named so far is a great football player, okay? But Chargers, I think, based on the Najee Harris and obviously more consequentially, I would say the first-round pick on Martin Hampton, Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we do end up seeing a similar pass rate from the Chargers as what we have in Philly. I think Ladd McConkey's great, Dwayne, but we've seen AJB be great for far longer than McConkey. Now, there's a little bit less target competition in Los Angeles. I will grant you that. But based on projected targets, they're coming out pretty similarly, man. I have moved A.J. Brown ahead of Ladd McConkey after having this discussion with myself. Will you do the same, Dwayne?
No, I'm going to keep Ladd ahead. But look, again, like A.J. Brown, like if I was starting an NFL franchise today, like it's A.J. Brown. But Ladd's really good as well. And man, when you just watch Ladd McConkey, like gets open at every level of the field. I think a lot of people think that he's more this line of scrimmage kind of guy, or you got to get him in the slot. And you really don't. I do agree with you about the potential here for the Chargers, especially knowing that we've got Harbaugh and Roman and that historical combination. We could see them run the ball more than what we saw last year. But at the same time, typically the teams that are the most run heavy, it's going to be really hard for them to be in that same range as the Eagles because they don't have a running quarterback. So the teams that typically are those ones where we're like, oh my God, like their drop back rate is less than actually, their design run rate. It's usually a Ravens type team. It's usually an Eagles type team or maybe even a Buffalo Bills type team where we know we're getting all these design rushing attempts to the quarterbacks, and we have dropbacks, the big part, turning into scrambles. So plays that start off being called, as a pass play, and they're ultimately turning into a run play. That's the other component of it. So it'll be tough when we get to pure pass attempts for the Chargers to have a floor as low as what we could have for the Eagles just because of that. Like they could come out and run the ball more, and I do think the signal is there, like you mentioned, with the signing of Najee Harris and the bigger signal spending the first-round draft capital on Omari and Hampton. So I think these two players are really close. It ultimately comes down to me. I think that Ladd McConkey is really good, and he does have less target competition, and I just don't think I don't think the floor is quite the same as far as the potential pass attempts for the season.
Got some more thoughts on McConkey as well as Drake London, guys, coming up shortly here as we break down the top 12 wide receivers ahead of 2025 fantasy football drafts. First, though, a quick word from our friends over at Bud Light.
Hey, you're not actually allowed to drink in a beer commercial?
Since when?
You gotta wait till it's done. Oh,
5,
4, 3, 2, 1.
All All right, Dwayne, the early parts, we've gotten a couple drafts done together, more on the way throughout the summer. We appreciate you guys always tuning into those. But I've talked about, when you get in the round two and you see someone like Jonathan Taylor, and it's just like, man, give me the 300, 350 touches we're going to get with any semblance of good health versus a wide receiver that we don't feel great about, okay? I think every wide receiver we've named so far, I feel pretty freaking great about, and I would cautiously include Ladd McConkey as well as Drake London in that group. That's about where I draw the line, and I start saying, you know what? Looking at JT, looking at Devon Achane, some of these other running backs, I'm a bit more willing to go for them after that. Is this where you're cutting off, again, I guess, our kind of elite wide receivers in the first, I'm fine if you want to break it up into 2 or 3 tiers, but where do you kind of draw a line and start saying, hey, Jonathan Taylor, how you doing?
No, that's where I've been drawing the line. And like once I get to there, I'm with you. That's where I start to look more to the running backs, might even consider one of the elite tight ends if they're still on the board. But Drake London and Ladd McConkey are in this group for me. Drake London, man, I mean, we're talking about a guy that's going into his age 24 season. Ian, look at his yards per route run last season, 2.32, a career high. Obviously, we saw what he did at the end of the year with Michael Penix, small sample guys, but it was pretty good. It was pretty good. Michael Penix basically just said, hey, man, Drake London's over there somewhere. It was just dialing it up, throwing this guy the ball. So, but at the same time, I think the path downward for Drake London could also be Michael Penix. And we've got these rumors that Kirk Cousins is really wanting to be traded. We'll see what happens with the Falcons. Can they actually make that happen or not? If we've got Kirk Cousins there, at least we know we have a backstop. Not what he once was, but we could feel like it's a livable situation, right? If they had to go to Cousins. So when we talk about McConkey, we know that we've got Justin Herbert. He's really proven. The question here in Atlanta, it really comes down to the quarterback. But as far as the talent goes with Drake London, yeah, man, this guy is an absolute beast. 27% adjusted target share when we adjust for actually, I didn't have to adjust it last year because he didn't miss a game. So 27% target share is really good. Look at his targets per route run, 27% as well. So beats man coverage, zone coverage, you name it. He was their number one wide receiver in all those scenarios. So doesn't have that gear to take off the top of a defense like some of the very top wide receivers that we talked about. But other than that, man, the short and intermediate game, Drake London can really do it all. And last year they tried to get him in the slot a little bit more, and that also helped him out. So yeah, I think he belongs in this conversation. I think there is a tier break, to be honest, and you probably do too. I think once you get to that Nabers, Brian Thomas Jr., Nico Collins, I think you're putting a cut right there. And then honestly, you could argue then it's A.J. Brown together with Drake London as well as Ladd McConkey. Talent-wise, look, guys, I get it. A.J. Brown's up at the very top, but he's got his own issues he's dealing with. So I'm probably going to end up, when I make my tiers, lumping him in together with these two players.
London, though, too, man, I know he got some Michael Pittman comps coming out, which could have just been a little bit of uniform watching. I certainly think he's a better talent than Michael Pittman. But just the fact that London can operate as well as he does underneath, using his quick feet, obviously had that, game time, or might have been game-winning touchdown against the Eagles. You saw him just, again, the things he can do for a 6'4" guy in the short areas of the field really are special. So I do think, even if he's not A.J. Brown, who is, but London, again, I think you would be hard-pressed to rank 10 or 12 just pure talent wide receivers ahead of this guy. And you mentioned the small sample size of Penix, Dwain, but hey, small sample size be damned out here. He was on pace for 221 targets if you want to go ahead and take that 3-game sample and moving on. And I know people also look at that 3-game sample for Penix and they say, oh, he wasn't all that accurate. Are we maybe overrating that, Dwayne? Because I will say, you look at Penix's 3 interceptions last year, 2 of them hit his receivers in the chest. The other one was actually attributed to a bad route post-game by the Falcons coaches themselves. And even kind of breaking it down, yes, I get it, sub 60% completion rate. He was also up there with only Anthony Richardson with an average target depth north of 10 yards. You look at his underneath completion percentage. It was actually right there with Matthew Stafford and Brock Purdy. Intermediate, he was better than Josh Allen, Caleb Williams, and Drake May. Even 20+, we're talking about being tied with Jordan Love, better than Bo Nix, Kyler, Tua, amongst others. So thoughts on the completion percentage being held so far against Penix? Because if I didn't know better, man, the Falcons, to me, they almost look like a cheaper version of what the Bengals are offering you in the AFC in fantasy drafts.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think with Penix, I gave him a 62% completion rate, so I'm assuming he does move up a little bit. I did believe that some of that was associated with his average depth of target. Now, he might continue really pushing the ball down the field, and if he does, then that's fine. You can be in that 60 to 62% completion rate. Where it's really a problem is if we look at you and you're like, hey, man, your average depth of target is 7 and you got a 60% completion rate, that would be really bad. So I do agree that it could be overblown. I think the big thing, though, is that Penix still is unproven. right? We've got such a small sample size. Most people thought that pick was a reach in last year's draft, so you got that question mark still looming. A lot of that you could say it was because he was an older prospect coming out of college, and I think you could also, when you start to slice and dice that, you could say, hey, there are also reasons for that. The guy had some major injuries in his college career, so it's not like if he had come out earlier, it probably would have helped him any. Like, he probably made the smart move by staying in college and then going and putting up those huge numbers in Washington. Actually did turn into a first-round NFL draft pick. The bottom line is that the Falcons did believe enough in him to take him there, Ian, and that's all that really matters at this point. So I'm a little bit skeptical with Penix, and that's ultimately like the biggest question mark for Drake London. I don't think we have any questions about the talent profile, but it could also go really well. Like, Penix could make this step forward, and we could be saying, hey, this is one of the better pocket passers in the league. And if that happens, and he's willing just to keep dialing things up for Drake London because he's one of these guys that, like, hey, I got this doesn't matter. Does he have man? Does he have zone? Is he getting double covered? There are some quarterbacks that won't care about that. Like, Jameis is a good example, and they'll just fire it in there. Maybe Penix is one of those guys. And if you get a quarterback that's willing to do that, and you have a talent like London, that can lead to massive, massive target totals.
I know they used a couple first-round picks, this year and the future to try to boof up that defensive line. But again, they got some talent in the secondary, A.J. Terrell and Jesse Bates and everything, but just really haven't seen that turn into great production on the field last few years. And, Darnell Mooney, even Kyle Pitts in the year of our Lord 2025. Again, I do think there's potential for Atlanta to not be the cleanest offense in the world, averaging 35 points per game. But hey, as we saw against the Commanders, against the Panthers down the stretch last year, do think we got some fun, fantasy-friendly shootouts, if you will. So, Dwain, again, those were, I believe, our top 11 wide receivers. And this is where things really kind of get thrown out of whack. There's a lot of different guys our rankers are kind of preferring in that 12 spot. So we're going to play everyone's favorite game here. Start, marry, cut for the 2025 season between three guys that I have seen each get that 12 spot: T. Higgins, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Tyreek Hill.
Man, and this really is tough. And I think I actually may have talked myself out of it as I was doing the research, just getting ready for the show. But I'm going to go with what I put down to start. Okay. So I was going to start Tyreek Hill. Now, the thing with Tyreek Hill, guys, he's going to be 31 years old this year, right? And so I went back and looked. Since 2011, here are the wide receivers that have put up a top 12 season at age 31 plus. Andre Johnson, dog, did it twice, Ian. Brandon Marshall did it once. Devontae Adams, we just saw him do it last year. Maybe he'll do it again this year. Jordy Nelson with Aaron Rodgers did it. Julian Edelman did it. Keenan Allen did it. Larry Fitzgerald had 3 seasons. Larry Fitzgerald did this 3 different times at age 31 plus. Mike Evans just did it. Reggie Wayne did it whenever he got Andrew Luck. Steve Smith was like 34 when he did it with the Ravens and then Wes Welker.
Yeah.
What's funny is when I first read the list, I was like, okay, these are all good wide receivers. Tyreek Hill's been a really good wide receiver. But then as I looked at it, I was like, man, these guys are all like bigger, either guys that could turn into possession receivers later in their career, or they move to the slot. None of them were really dependent on their speed. Now, you could argue Steve Smith, but they really changed Steve Smith's role when he was in the Ravens. He was no longer running that vertical route tree. He was more of that Z option, right, where they're using more underneath. And back then, if you remember, they were running that Kubiak-style offense or Shanahan-style offense, and they were letting Steve Smith, get a lot of those looks like what you would see from Debo. So, man, like after I read at first, I was like, this is a really good list. And then I thought, like, Tyreek Hill's not like any of these guys. Like, if he lost his speed, like, it could be an issue. But then I also dug into it a little more. Like, it's not like Tyreek Hill's this guy, Ian, that's got an average depth of target of 15, 16. Like, his average depth of target over the last 3 years with Miami has been between 11 and 12, right? So he gets a lot of looks, short, intermediate. Yes, he does get some deep looks. More of them were last year, but some of that may have came back to the quarterback. So I'm going to stick with it, even though after, like, I looked through this list and thought about it, I thought I might be wrong. I did put to Mary JSN, and I'll just, I'll keep it short item, pitch it back to you. He's young, and he broke out last year. I just want to bet on players that break out when they're still really young, and he's a profile we like coming out of college. And sadly, that means it's a cut for T. Higgins, which is, again, you could dice this any way you want. This sucks. I would never really want to cut T. Higgins, but in this case, he's the guy that I did cut. I do think he's due for some negative touchdown regression if you look at what he did last year. He's also a player that pretty much every single season misses games.
He has had a hamstring injury every single year, going back to, I believe, even 2019. Like, he had one his last year in college as well at Clemson, and then each and every season. So he's played through a lot of them, but yeah, back-to-back years with just 12 games. And let's face it, Dwain, last year was great seeing him finish as the wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game. He actually had another top 12 finish alongside Jamar Chase as well. But you talk about someone that we are drafting, I think, a bit closer to their ceiling than their floor. I mean, okay, yes, if something happened to Chase, then that argument would go out the window, but tough to really assume that's going to be the case at wide receiver. Yes, I did just knock on wood a lot of times, Bengals fans. So with Tyreek Hill, I'm with you, man. It's been one of the tougher evaluations. I've talked about Ashton Genty and kind of going back and forth between RB3 and RB7. Tyreek's one of these guys where some days I'm like, okay, he's aging. What are we doing here? Like, it wasn't good last year. I know he was injured, but his hand didn't stop him from, it's not like he was dropping 10 passes out there. You know what I'm saying? So I don't love that. But then I say 1 year removed for almost 1,800 yards and 13 touchdowns. I mean, we could be sitting here watching week 1 as he's just going nuts, going, yeah, he's Tyreek Hill. Why are we ever doubting this dude? But man, I feel like round 3, round 4, though, Dwain, especially if I am in a draft where I said, oh my God, CMC, Devon Achane, okay, and I need a wide receiver in round 3. Tyreek does stand out to me in this group as a guy where just instantly could be that top 5 player, the Alvin Kamara, if you will, of wide receivers, maybe.
Yeah, and last year I did a study on what happens as far as the way wide receivers age, but the way I handled it is I compared them to their best 3 years of their career, which we call prime production, okay? And if you look at it, those receivers, once they get to age 31, 68% of what they did in their prime. Well, the problem is whenever your prime was nearly 2,000 yards receiving, it's still really good. It's still going to be better than a lot of other guys at their actual prime, which is where you get 93%, right, of your best production years. So there is definitely a drop-off, though, in the data. If you look at ages 28 to 29, it falls to 84% of what they did in their prime. You get to that age 30 bucket, falls to 78%. And then when you get to age 31, it falls to 68%. But again, I think a lot of it comes back to whether or not you can still remain fantasy relevant. It comes back to, well, what was your prime like? If you were a 1,500, 1,700, 2,000 yard wide receiver, that's very different than if your prime was a 1,200 yard wide receiver who caught 8 touchdowns. And so I just feel like there's a lot of cushion here for Tyreek. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with it. But I do think there's the caveat when we look at those wide receivers that were successful later in their careers, most of them had more of those possession traits, and most of them also moved to the slot. Or they were already slot wide receivers. And those are things Tyreek Hill does not have going for him right now.
Does get a lot of motion snaps, which is cool. Mike McDaniel, helps him out there. But, play action as well. So, again, we keep going back and forth even as we're discussing this about the guys. So, one of the tougher evaluations for sure of this cycle. I do not think it'll be the last time we are breaking down Tyreek here.
So, did you marry JSN or did you marry Tyreek? Because it sounds like you were cutting Higgins with me. As tough as it was.
I'd marry Tyreek. I would start Higgins. I think I'd cut JSN. I'm just a little bit concerned about the overlap. We are giving Clint Kubiak so much credit for a nice 2-game sample against the Panthers and Cowboys. I just think Darnold, there's a chance of implosion here, all right? And JSN, as good as he was last year, I am a little bit worried that a ton of it was due to Geno Smith being one of the more underrated QBs out there. Also had the DK Metcalf injury. And hey, man, we've seen JSN really in about 4 halves of, seasons. He's been really freaking good in one of them, not so much the other 3. So that's my concern with JSN.
Yeah. My big concern is, are they really not just going to play Cooper Kupp in the slot? Are they going to make Cooper Kupp play on the outside? Or maybe it's going to be a rotation, right? And they'll each get snaps inside. They're both very, I think their profiles both are really dependent on playing from the slot. I do think one of them could play Z and one could play slot. But then to your point, there's this duplicity in what they do and who's really going to stretch out the defense and make the defenses respect that stuff. So I get it. I went with JSN because typically I just want to I want to bet on players that are breaking out at a young age. But I do agree. And then when the Sam Darnold, man, if the offensive line is an issue, there could be an implosion.
I had a dark thought last night, Dwain. Grilled some steaks and chicken for the fam. Lovely Sunday evening, but I was sitting
You only have positive thoughts when you're grilling chicken steaking. Steak and chicken. Yeah.
I thought to myself, what if Marquez Valdes-Scantling is the guy you need in round 18? Is he not just a cheaper version of
No,
Darius
he's not. That's not a terrible. No, I think that's fine. honestly.
Yeah.
Like he is Darius Slayton a little better, but yes, I agree with you. Like he's going to be he's the only guy that can do what he does for the team. He's
kind of
I would bet that he's going to have like an 80 to 90% route participation. He might not come off the field in 2 wide receiver sets. It might be one of Cooper Kupp or JSN.
All right, we have reached the
You are. That is a dark thought. Why'd you make me
It
do
is
this? Jeez.
I just wanted to end everyone with a little MVS tidbit there. So that's going to do it for us here on the Fantasy Life Show, everybody. We'll be back breaking down, again, more sleepers and breakouts, if you will, at the wide receiver position outside the top 12, but we appreciate you tuning in for now. So for Dwain, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.